When a middle school teacher tries to humiliate a 13-year-old black student by forcing him to solve an impossible math problem in front of the whole class, she expects failure. But what happens next leaves the entire room speechless, and flips the power dynamic in the most unexpected way. At Westfield Middle School, the days moved in predictable rhythm. Students shuffled in half asleep each morning, greeted by the sound of squeaking sneakers and slamming lockers. Classrooms filled with chatter that quickly died down as the first period bells rang. In room 204, however, the atmosphere always felt just a little colder, a little stiffer, especially for one student in particular, 13-year-old Jaden Carter. Jaden wasn't the kind of kid who made waves. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't raise his hand unless he was sure of the answer, and didn't cause trouble even when trouble found him. He was the kind of student who teachers usually loved, quiet, respectful, on time. But for some reason, none of that seemed to matter to Ms. Ramsey. Ms. Ramsey was the type of teacher who ran her classroom like a military unit. She demanded silence, precision, and complete obedience. While some students admired her strictness, others feared her sharp tongue and icy glare. But beneath the surface of her high standards was a pattern that didn't go unnoticed by many in the room. It always seemed like Jaden was the one she called out when homework wasn't perfect. He was the one asked to stay after class for the smallest infractions. He was the one who got asked questions that were a level harder than anyone else's. To most kids, it might have seemed like she just expected more from Jaden. But the truth was, Jaden could feel it in his gut. It wasn't about higher expectations. It was about putting him in his place. Jaden sat in the third row from the front, right next to the window. His desk, covered with pencil doodles and the faint carvings of past students' initials, had become something of a safe zone for him. He kept his eyes down, his hands folded, and his voice low. Every day, he just tried to make it through math class without being singled out. But almost every day, Ms. Ramsey found a reason to turn her attention to him. "Jaden, you were the last to finish the worksheet, again," she'd say loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Are we having trouble understanding basic multiplication?" Or, "Jaden, next time, maybe try showing your work instead of guessing. This isn't a game show." It was never about offering help or guidance. It was always about embarrassment. Sometimes, Jaden would hear the whispers from the other students. The snickers. The muttered jokes about how he always got grilled. Some even assumed he deserved it. But what no one seemed to know was that Jaden was far from slow. In fact, he was anything but average. At home, Jaden devoured books on physics and programming. He could solve complex equations in his head and had a photographic memory for anything he read. His mother, a nurse who worked night shifts, often came home to find him watching documentaries on black holes or teaching himself new coding languages. He didn't tell anyone at school about it. Why would he? All it had ever earned him was suspicion and mockery. Jaden had been tested when he was younger. His IQ ranked in the top 0.1% of the country. The district had even recommended him for a gifted program, but due to a paperwork error and his family moving schools, it had all gotten lost in the shuffle. No teacher ever followed up. And in Ms. Ramsey's class, he was just another kid who sat too quietly, answered too slowly, and looked too different from the one she favored. Some of the other students noticed it too. Kids like Marcus and Lily, who sat on either side of the classroom, occasionally gave Jaden sympathetic glances when Ms. Ramsey was especially harsh. But they never said anything aloud. No one wanted to be the next target. Despite all this, Jaden never pushed back. He took the harsh words. He stayed behind after class when asked. He turned in his work early, hoping to avoid more criticism. But no matter what he did, it was never enough for her. And somewhere deep down, he started to believe maybe that was just how it had to be. Maybe some teachers would always treat certain kids differently. The truth was, Jaden had grown used to flying under the radar. Keeping his intelligence to himself felt safer. Showing what he was capable of had only ever brought him more trouble. So he played small, stayed invisible, and waited for each class to end. But there's only so long a genius can hide. What Jaden didn't know was that the very thing Ms. Ramsey used to try and humiliate him would soon become the moment that revealed everything. The years he spent shrinking himself would come to an end with a single question on the board, and when that moment came, the entire classroom would see a very different version of the boy they thought they knew. Math class had always been Ms. Ramsey's domain. She relished her authority and ran her classroom with a strict sense of order. To her, rules and structure weren't just important, they were essential. But more than that, she enjoyed control. And sometimes, that control veered into territory where power became performance, especially when it came to students she didn't believe belonged at the top. Jaden had been in her sights for weeks. There was something about the way he stayed quiet, the way he never reacted, that seemed to irritate her. It was as if his silence challenged her dominance. Most kids she could rattle with a harsh tone or a pointed question. But Jaden just sat there, calm, unbothered, never giving her the reaction she seemed to want. In her mind, that made him defiant, even if he never said a word out of turn. That day, she had arrived with something different in mind. The lesson plan on the board was supposed to cover quadratic equations, a subject most of the class had only just begun to understand. But during her lunch break, she had scribbled out a much more advanced problem. Something entirely outside the scope of the curriculum. It was the kind of equation students wouldn't usually encounter until advanced algebra or even early college coursework. She waited until the class was settled. After going through a few routine problems and calling on students who stumbled through answers, she decided it was time. With a grin tugging at the corner of her mouth, she turned back to the whiteboard and began writing the problem. A long, complex expression with multiple variables, exponents, and nested parentheses. The class watched with wide eyes. Whispers filled the room. No one had seen anything like it before. The numbers sprawled across the board like a foreign language. Some students began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was obvious this wasn't part of today's assignment. But no one said anything. Not yet. When she was finished writing, Ms. Ramsey capped her marker and turned around slowly. Her eyes scanned the room for a moment, lingering briefly on students who looked away or avoided eye contact. Then they landed on Jaden. She didn't hesitate. She called on him by name, her voice sharp and slightly amused. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The entire class froze. Heads turned toward Jaden in unison. A few students sucked in their breath, expecting him to resist or at least hesitate. Others whispered his name in disbelief. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't a genuine question or an academic challenge. It was a performance. Ms. Ramsey was trying to make a point, and Jaden had been chosen as the example. For a moment, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that comes with confusion or uncertainty, but the kind that feels heavy, like a storm is just beginning to form. The weight of her intent was obvious. She didn't expect Jaden to solve the problem. She expected him to fail. Publicly. That was the real lesson she wanted to teach that day. To most of the class, it felt cruel. Jaden hadn't raised his hand. He hadn't volunteered. He had simply been singled out, again. But no one dared to speak up. They had seen what happened to students who tried to defend others. Ms. Ramsey didn't forget. And she didn't forgive. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. Jaden didn't show panic. He didn't argue. His expression was unreadable. But something had shifted. Something subtle, almost invisible. The same student who had always lowered his eyes and taken the criticism without complaint now stood on the edge of a moment that no one, not even he, fully understood. In the back of the room, a few students whispered to each other, wondering if Jaden would even attempt it. Others braced themselves for the awkwardness of watching him stumble through something far too advanced. Even the students who liked him weren't sure what to expect. Ms. Ramsey stood with her arms crossed, clearly waiting to deliver the final blow. She had set the stage perfectly, a seemingly impossible problem, a student she believed couldn't possibly solve it, and a classroom full of witnesses to his failure. Her posture radiated confidence. She had no doubt in her mind that Jaden was about to prove her right. But what Ms. Ramsey didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jaden had seen problems like this before. Not in school, not in textbooks, but on his own. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world was asleep and he was free to explore the universe of numbers and logic that fascinated him. He had studied problems twice as hard, tackled equations 4 times as long. Not because he had to, but because he loved it. Because math, to him, wasn't a subject. It was a language he understood better than most people understood their own thoughts. The stage had been set for a mockery. But what was coming next would turn that setup into a revelation. In trying to shame him, Ms. Ramsey had unknowingly handed him the perfect opportunity. One that would change how everyone in that classroom viewed Jayden forever. The classroom, still frozen in anticipation, was seconds away from witnessing a moment no one could have predicted. The assumption had been simple and unchallenged. Jayden would fail, fumble, or stand silently in defeat. That was the design of the moment, a quiet, calculated humiliation. But what followed was a quiet unraveling of every expectation. Without the theatrics of hesitation or the nerves of performance, Jayden began to solve the equation. The same equation that had been meant to trip him up now seemed to unfold before him like a familiar path. Step by step, he navigated it, not with guesswork or confusion, but with clarity. He didn't just write the answer. He broke down the components, simplified expressions, identified patterns, and showed each layer of logic with effortless precision. As he moved through the steps, something in the air shifted. The classroom, once silent in tension, became silent in awe. There was no mockery now, no hidden smiles, no expectant eyes waiting for a failure. What remained was curiosity, confusion, and for the first time, respect. Line after line, Jayden continued. He reorganized terms, applied rules that were supposed to be beyond his grade level, and simplified until the problem, once intimidating and unreadable to most of the room, was reduced to a clean, clear solution. It wasn't just that he got it right. It was how he got there. The logic he applied wasn't random or rehearsed, it was advanced, sharp, academic. He was explaining concepts no one had taught them yet. Concepts most students wouldn't see for another 2 or 3 years. And yet, Jayden moved through them as if they were second nature. The teacher, who had watched with a smirk of superiority, was now standing still. Her expression had shifted. No longer confident, no longer in control. Her brows furrowed slightly as she scanned the board, checking each step, silently verifying if what he had written was correct. It was. Not a single misstep. Not a single skipped process. Students turned to one another, mouths slightly open, exchanging glances that said what no one was ready to say out loud. Jayden wasn't struggling. He wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what he was doing. Some students leaned forward, now more interested in learning how he did it than watching him fail. For the first time, eyes weren't rolling, they were wide. The problem that had been intended as a trap had turned into a platform. Jayden, the quiet boy who rarely spoke unless called on, had just solved a complex equation most of the class couldn't even begin to understand. And he did it without bragging, without fanfare, without even raising his voice. His confidence wasn't loud, it was precise. In the span of a few minutes, years of assumptions unraveled. The narrative that had been silently accepted by the classroom, that Jayden was slow, unengaged, or simply average, no longer held. The teacher's authority, once unquestioned, had been quietly disrupted by something more powerful than rebellion, truth. There was something undeniable about raw talent. Something undeniable about genius when it appeared in unexpected places. And now, the entire room had seen it. Not heard about it, not imagined it, witnessed it. Live. Without warning. For Jayden, there was no victory lap. No triumphant gesture. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from knowing your worth even when others refuse to see it. He hadn't wanted to prove anything. He hadn't asked to be tested. But when the moment came, he didn't shrink. He showed up, not to impress, but simply to answer the challenge. What Ms. Ramsey had expected to be a spectacle of failure had become something else entirely, a revelation. The boy she had underestimated, belittled, and pushed into silence had just displayed a level of intelligence that transcended grade levels. Her assumptions, now laid bare in front of her students, could no longer be defended. The whispers returned to the classroom, but they had changed in tone. They were no longer filled with mockery. They carried curiosity, respect, and even apology. A few students looked at Jayden with admiration. Others simply stared, unsure of what they had just seen. The energy in the room no longer belonged to Ms. Ramsey. It belonged to the boy who had never needed to shout to be heard. For Jayden, the moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about something deeper, dignity. The kind of dignity that can't be granted by teachers or classmates or test scores. The kind that comes from knowing who you are, even when others don't. In that moment, something shifted permanently. Jaden had arrived in that classroom as a target. But by the time he sat back down, he was something far more powerful. He was undeniable. The shock of the moment lingered far beyond the last number Jaden wrote on the board. The classroom that had once overlooked him was now filled with students trying to process what they had just seen. It wasn't every day that a classmate rewrote his entire identity in under 10 minutes. Jaden had gone from the quiet kid in the back to the one who had outsmarted a challenge even the teacher wasn't prepared to match. The whispers didn't stop at the end of class. They followed into the hallways, the lunchroom, and even after school. Jaden's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, not as a punchline or a mystery, but as a topic of genuine amazement. Students who had barely acknowledged him were now curious. They wondered how long he had been this smart. They wondered why he had kept it to himself. They wondered how a boy they'd underestimated could be carrying such extraordinary knowledge inside him all this time. What they didn't realize was that Jaden never kept his intelligence a secret to impress. He kept it quiet to protect his peace. Being exceptional at something rarely brings only praise. Sometimes it attracts scrutiny, jealousy, and, in Jaden's case, unfair judgment. He knew that being a black boy with a genius IQ wasn't always treated as a gift. Sometimes it was seen as a challenge to authority. Sometimes it made people uncomfortable. That's why he had learned to observe more than speak, to listen more than argue. It wasn't because he lacked confidence. It was because he understood the weight of how people saw him. He had grown up knowing that excellence from someone who looked like him wasn't always welcomed. But he also knew that one moment of clarity, one undeniable truth, could be more powerful than 1,000 arguments. Now that moment had arrived, and it had changed everything. Among the students, a shift in perception was taking place. They began to treat Jaden differently, not with fear or over-the-top admiration, but with a kind of respect he had never been afforded before. His peers started coming to him with real questions, seeking help, looking to learn. For the first time, they weren't looking past him. They were looking up to him. The teachers, too, had to reckon with what they had seen. Word had traveled fast. A few had quietly pulled his previous test scores and assignments, trying to understand how they had missed it. But the truth was, they hadn't been looking. Jaden had done what was asked, no more, no less. And because he never raised his voice or demanded attention, his brilliance had been overlooked. It was a reminder to the staff that genius doesn't always come with noise or arrogance. Sometimes it walks quietly and waits for its time. For Ms. Ramsey, the moment was harder to face. The performance she had orchestrated to embarrass Jaden had backfired in front of the entire class. She had underestimated a student not because of his ability, but because of her own biases. Her confidence in her authority had blinded her to the intelligence sitting quietly before her every day. She had to grapple not just with embarrassment, but with the realization that her actions had been rooted in prejudice. And now, there was no hiding from it. Jaden, however, didn't seek revenge or confrontation. He didn't ask for an apology or use his newfound recognition as a weapon. Instead, he carried himself the same way he always had, with calm, humility, and quiet strength. That, more than anything, left an impression. It showed his peers that true intelligence doesn't need to boast. It simply proves itself. What had started as an attempt to mock him had turned into a life-changing moment, not just for Jaden, but for everyone who witnessed it. His story spread beyond the classroom. A counselor who heard about the incident contacted a local gifted program. Soon after, Jaden was invited to take part in advanced enrichment courses designed for high-performing students. For the first time, he was surrounded by mentors and educators who recognized his potential and nurtured it. But more than academic opportunity, Jaden had gained something even more valuable: freedom. He no longer felt the need to shrink himself to avoid judgment. He no longer feared being seen. The moment on the board had taught him, and everyone else, that silence could be mistaken for ignorance, but proof leaves no room for doubt. Jaden's journey reminded his school of something essential. Talent isn't defined by how loudly it demands attention, nor is brilliance reserved for those who fit a particular mold. Sometimes, the most powerful minds are sitting in plain sight, waiting for a moment to be challenged, not to prove others wrong, but to prove themselves right. In the days that followed, The school moved on, as schools often do. But one thing had changed forever. Jaden was no longer invisible. He had earned his place, not through rebellion, but through undeniable truth. He had shown the power of knowing who you are, even when the world doubts you. And from that day forward, no one ever looked at him the same again. Sometimes, it only takes one moment to reveal the truth. Jaden didn't need to shout, argue, or demand attention. He let his brilliance speak for itself, and in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that genius knows no color, no stereotype, and no classroom boundaries. How many other Jadens are out there, overlooked, underestimated, and waiting for their moment? Let this be a wake-up call. Never judge a book by its cover, and never assume someone's limits based on what you think you know. Respect isn't given because of age, race, or titles. It's earned, and Jaden earned his in the most powerful way. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, kindness, respect, and opportunity can change a life. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that inspire change.